Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the writer of Batman, Deathstroke Incorporated?
Yep.
Robin, the upcoming Justice League 75, in which he'll permanently kill the Justice League forever. The upcoming Dark Crisis, which will presumably be about how they'll continue to be dead forever, and the just-launched Rogues at DC Black Label. It's Joshua Williamson. Thanks for coming on, Joshua.
Yeah, it's always great to talk to you. We can talk about comic books, mostly Rogues.
Mostly Rogues. Well, it is a big week for you. Rogues #1 debuted. You had new issues for Deathstroke Inc. and Robin. You're getting art from Jim Chung for Dark Crisis #0. Feel good?
Yeah, it feels great. Yeah, I mean, the Jim Chung stuff is amazing. I was talking to Daniel Sampere about this morning. We both have been fans of his for a long time. I was a fan of his back when he worked on Flash, like a lifetime ago. And then I followed him to CrossGen when he was doing Scion. And he was just always been one of my favorites. And then he went over to go do Marvel and do Young Avengers. And, I'd done a bunch of stuff over there, like Infinity. He was always one of my favorites. And I remember when he got to work on Justice League with Scott and James, I was always jealous because it was like just out of reach, because I was like working on that stuff with them, but I wasn't working directly on that book. So I always wanted to work with him. And so when we started putting together this Dark Crisis 0, they mentioned him. DC was like, we're thinking about Jim Chung. And I was like, yes, please, can we do that? Yes. And so I've met him a few times. We got on the phone. I pitched him what it was going to be, got his thoughts on it, wrote it up, sent him, and then he just knocked it out, and it looks amazing. It's a short story about sort of the bridge between Justice League 75 and Dark Crisis, but I also was aware of the fact it's for Free Comic Book Day, so I wanted to be really accessible to people and have it be a different tone than everything else we're doing. But it stars Wally West as the Flash, and he's on a little adventure with some kids in the Hall of Justice. It's mostly it's a fun story, even though there is an undercurrent of the death of the Justice League stuff going on. But yeah, working with him was amazing. He was really great and really receptive. But at the same time, and this is the same experience I had on Rogues, it's one of those things where you just kind of like, you take a step back and you just watch someone work. And the stuff that he turned in for that short was amazing. But yeah, I posted that first page today, and I'll probably post another page this week. Yeah, it was great. Jim Chung is amazing. He's one of my favorites.
I think it's funny. I'm going to bring this up later, but I do think to a certain degree, when I read about Dark Crisis, it kind of feels like, I don't want to say it's an event about events, but it feels like an event that's through like the filter of like all other events to a certain degree. It's like got the death of Superman 30th anniversary kind of vibe. There's a lot of like DNA from other events I can kind of feel in there, but I think it's perfect that you have Jim on #0 because of that.
Yeah.
Because he's always been a guy that Marvel and DC taps when you want a story to start with weight. Maybe he doesn't finish the whole book, but when you bring him in on that first, then on that 0, that #1, whatever, you know it's serious business.
Yeah, I mean, there definitely is a meta-ness to it. And yeah, we can get in that deeper. I mean, the idea of it being a little bit about events was something that was on my mind a lot when I was putting it together. I just really wanted to show an event from different perspectives and make an event a bit more about the characters and those relationships between people at DC, and then me saying something about DC. But yeah, there's a lot of DNA of like Infinite Crisis, Crisis on Infinite Earths, and, I looked at Final Crisis a lot, and I spoke to Grant recently, and I'm going to be curious what people are going to think about with Dark Crisis, because it definitely gets very meta at times. I mean, there's a whole thing where in the first issue, so I wrote issue 1 of Dark Crisis before I wrote 75. And when I wrote Dark Crisis #1, there's a scene where there's a few scenes throughout this book about they're talking about what death actually means in the DCU now, considering they've all died and come back. And how do people react to that, and how different characters react to it differently. But I was thinking about people on the ground and how people on the ground react to those ideas of like these heroes die and then they come back from the dead. And there's a scene in issue 1 where people are protesting the Hall of Justice. And some people are like, they're going to come back. There's like signs like they're going to come back. And there's some people that are like, that really believe they're dead. And so I was showing that sort of different takes on that idea.
Mm-hmm.
And that page was drawn a while ago. And then I wrote 75, and then we announced 75. And it was so awesome to watch people react to the news, the death of Superman, because when I was watching them react, I was like, oh my gosh, this is how people react in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Like the way people were reacting to it, the sort of the sentiment and the outrage in certain different directions and the belief and how people are newer, it was really fascinating to watch people like really believe it and how they reacted, and then the people that were like bullshit and they did not like it, they did not react to it well, and how that's in the book because like when Hal Jordan in issue 1, when Hal Jordan finds out, he literally is like bullshit.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, we blurb it out, but you know, he has that reaction, and he's like, I don't believe this. And so I wanted to play around with some of those ideas. With Dan Jurgens, is drawing a story in the Road to Dark Crisis special that I wrote that's about John and Nightwing talking about it and dealing with it. And so he and I had a whole conversation when we were working on that about all this stuff. And I mean, you know, the biggest death ever in comics he did, so he has his own take and his own feelings on it. And so I was able to talk with him a little bit about it. I'm really curious how people are going to respond to it, because it is, you know, there is a lot of big explosions and drama and all that, but then there's also a lot of mostly character. It's mostly about the character that are reacting to things. It's gonna be a different kind of event. There is a bit of meta-ness to it. But we'll see how it goes when it's coming out. I'm excited about it. I'm excited about doing something a little different with a Crisis event.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've seen a Crisis event from Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman's perspective. I wanted to try something different in this one. So, I mean, we'll see. It's going to be really interesting.
I do think it's interesting. The one kind of curveball event that I kind of saw in its DNA, and maybe this is me reading too much into it, and what you're talking about and the reaction reminds me of it, is Avengers Disassembled, actually.
Dude, I was like super influenced by Avengers Assembled on this one.
Yeah.
Like a lot. Yeah, a lot. Way back in the day, I was the manager of a comic book store, and I was in charge of the orders. Like I was, you know, I would do all the order numbering, all that stuff. We probably talked about this before. And FOC had just been introduced. Like it maybe been a year in with FOC. And I remember I was in the comic book store. It was late at night, and I got a PDF from Marvel, and it was like, this is Avengers Assembled 500. And I was a huge, or Avengers 500, you know, Avengers Assembled. And I was a huge Bendis fan. And so I was like so excited for that story. So I was like, hell yeah, I'm reading this right now. And I read that PDF and I was blown away, and I ordered like way more. I immediately went to the FOC and just started, I was blown away by it. And I was like, I got to print this out and like show it to people. I was so pumped up by it. And that really was a big deal. And I think a lot of the stuff that Bendis sort of set up at that time period, the DNA of that, I think a lot of that, I mean, it's so influential on what we have now with the MCU, like with the movies. Like, I don't think people recognize, and somebody can tell me if I'm wrong about this, the Avengers brand was not a big deal at once upon a time.
No.
And when they did Avengers Assembled, it became a big deal.
Yeah.
And then you take that and you bleed it out to what they were planning to do with the movies, and it just became this thing that we have now. And I think a lot of that is owed to that one issue. So I had reread in the pandemic, in the first year of the pandemic, I went on a big Bendis reread. Like I reread all of Daredevil, all Ultimate Spider-Man, and I went in on Avengers, and I was reading all of Avengers. I was bugging Bendis because when we got to Secret Invasion, I was texting him questions about Secret Invasion.
Oh my God.
When I got to it in my reread, and I was texting him questions about Secret Invasion, and I was just kind of like, how did you guys do this? How did you guys set up this crossover? How did you set up these events? And I could tell he was like a little annoyed by it, because he's like, we're trying to set up now. We should be thinking about this stuff now at DC. Why are you rereading all this Marvel stuff?
Yeah.
But I think he also didn't want, you know, I think for some creators, and I understand this, I'm sure I'm like this too in some places, you don't always want to revisit like old work. But I was like, I have no fear. So I was just texting questions about Secret Invasion when I got to it, just about how the logistics of how it all pulled together.
Yeah.
But yeah, Avengers Assembled 500 is definitely something. And the reaction to it, I was thinking about it a couple days ago, that once New Avengers started, there was also that issue that Steve McNiven drew where the Alpha Flight were killed in an issue, you know? And so a lot of that stuff definitely did kind of feed into some of the stuff we're doing. Like I know I'm influenced by those things. I try to look outside of comics a lot, but I'm not going to lie. Like, I've been working in comics for a very long time. If you go back to my first job ever, I was working at a comic book store when I was 14. I was 14. And I started working at a comic book store. And they hired me because I was the annoying kid in the comic book store to begin with. So I've been around this for so long. Like, it's definitely in the DNA of me. And like those experiences are part of me as a writer. So
Well, we've talked about this before, both in interviews and outside of them. I mean, you're talking about it right now. You think about this stuff a lot, like how comics work, what worked before, how it could work again, but in a new way. And it seems like you kind of looked at the DNA of all of these events and looked at like what connected them, but also what was missing. And that's kind of what Dark Crisis was built from.
there was a lot of that, yeah. Oh, I mean, I've worked on all these events too. Like I've worked for DC now for 6 years, 6.5 years again. And in that time, I worked on a lot of events, or I was a consultant on events, or I wrote events. Like I've been, I don't know, it's interesting to kind of see these things develop. And, being a fan of things like Infinite Crisis, going to panels and reading and asking questions at panels and reading all the interviews, it gave me an insight into a lot of this stuff. And so I was able to get in there and kind of just think about my own thoughts on events. And with this one in particular, you sort of hit on the head where it's like, I want to take stuff from the past and move it into the future. But I think all these pieces work. Like my favorite version of DC are the times where the past, present, and future were all working together.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to do that again here. Like, and I've talked about this a lot recently. When back in the early 90s, when I was like a little kid, and a comic book store opened near my house, and I started going and getting comics weekly on a regular basis. That was at a time where DC was through kind of a state of change because of Death of Superman, but also because of Nightfall. And you had Hal Jordan going crazy, but then we got Kyle. Tim Drake was coming up. Bart was coming up. Connor was coming up. You had Connor Hawke coming up. You had new Wonder Girl. All these things were sort of popping up. But then you also had, get kind of a couple years into that, and you have JLA launches and JSA launches. And, we had a couple different Legion of Superhero books. There was Zero Hour. All of those pieces were working really well.
Yeah.
And that's the stuff that I wanted to kind of touch on is you can, how do I put this? It's never about replacing, it's about adding.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I was interested in, was like showing that what DC's doing right now is not about replacing, it's about adding. And all these things can operate together and you can build these families. Like so much of what DC is about, it is about change and about adding. If you went and it's like, if DC never went through any changes, then it would still be Jay Garrick and Alan Scott.
Right.
But we got Hal and Barry. And, it's funny to me when I see someone talk about not liking change at DC, but they love Tim Drake and they love Kyle.
Right.
And I'm just like, yo, people had to die for you to get those characters.
Yeah. That's the thing too, is and I think you're thinking about this when it comes to approaching Dark Crisis and all of this, is that everyone entered into comics from a different point. Like Tim Drake was always Robin to that person. Damian Wayne was always Robin to somebody,
Oh, yeah. Somebody pointed this out to me. They were talking about, I mean, I think you know this. I don't really pay much attention to comics Twitter. Too much attention to what's going on. I have it, as you know, I have it blocked like all the time.
Yeah.
But somebody pointed out to me that somebody was complaining about something, and then they said they consider themselves an expert. And they said they started reading comics 10 years ago. And my friend who was talking about this, they were kind of complaining about it. And they were like, that means they didn't even start reading. They're reading post New 52. They probably started reading with Saga. They probably started reading comics when Saga #1 came out.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh my gosh, like that, it really gives you some perspective on their perspective.
Right.
But also they're reading a lot of this stuff in its, and I think this is massively true right now because of the availability of a lot of comics and the fact that you have things like Marvel Unlimited and DC Infinity and a million trades of everything.
Mm-hmm.
They get to read more books in their totality, right? And it's a different experience. And so if you get to sit down and read an entire piece of work, it's a different experience, but it also gives you, I think, different expectations. And it creates a kind of, I don't know the word habit. Habit's not the right word. But I think it gives you a different experience than, say, someone like I had, where there were less trades, there was no internet. Like there was internet, but not like we have now readily available, and trades were a rare thing.
Yeah.
Like the fact that I remember going to a panel in Washington, D.C., where Jurgens was talking about how much of a big deal it was they got the trade out for Death of Superman so fast, and it sold so well. Like they had never even thought it would sell well because it was a reprint in their mind,
Mm-hmm.
repurposed in Cell, but that thing sold so much that it was like, the light bulb went off at DC at that time of like, we got to start doing more of this. I remember Marvel would put out Marvel Masterworks, and that's how you got collections.
Yeah.
It was like, this story just came out, let's get that trade out. And I think that experience, it gives people just a different experience of comics that we didn't have, but there's also an impatience there with storytelling, because now when they go, okay, well, I'm gonna start reading books now, they're having to read these stories as tiny puzzle pieces versus getting to sit down. Could you imagine, like, you get to sit down and power through all of Starman in a weekend?
That would be a lot. That's a lot of reading for me.
It'd be a lot, but you could do it. You could. Like, I love this book, I'm doing it. And then let's say the next day you're like, or I'm picking up issue 1 of this book. How frustrating could that be? And
yeah.
I think it's very, very fascinating. But I do think about this stuff a lot, probably too much.
I think it's interesting to look at it through the prism of other forms of entertainment also. I know parents with kids who their kids like love Friends. And I think at least in part because there's like so much of it. Well, like when it was on Netflix, there was like all the seasons were on there, so they could just binge watch all of it. And it was like you get immersed in this stuff. Or like The Office. The Office was immensely popular because you could watch all of it. It's both of those are good shows also, but you can just binge it. Versus like I can't even imagine being like a young person and trying to watch week to week sitcoms. It would feel like molasses. It would feel horrible. And I get that. I totally get that. But it is interesting because, as you said, it's just like you're trying to approach this event as like this is an event that could be, maybe they haven't read Infinite Frontier and Justice League Incarnate. Maybe they haven't read any DC comic before and they're coming into it. I do want to say, I don't want to go too much more into this because like this is ostensibly where we're going to be talking about rogues, but but Dark Crisis is interesting because it seems like you're really building into it about legacy, and you're also orienting around how people deal with death. Another title that reminds me of is it reminds me of, the Krakoan era of X-Men in some ways, because it's like,
I like how you say that as if that was a long time ago.
Oh yeah, back in oh god, I mean it feels like 1,000 years ago. What was that, 2018? Good lord. But and it's still going on, and it's like I think part of the reason why people responded to it was because it looked at death in a different way. And I think that over the last few years you've seen a lot of superhero writers looking at death from a different perspective because the old answers don't always work in the same way.
Yeah. I remember when we were working on something at DC a few years ago, and I remember being in the room and we were just talking about stuff, and I was looking at like the history of the DCU, and we were just bouncing ideas around, and it made me realize how often the characters had died, and how some of them had died multiple times in a short period of time.
Wait, really quick, you brought up Hal earlier. Has Hal ever actually died? He did die, didn't he?
Yes, of course he did.
Well, I mean, okay, so he was the Spectre, but I mean, he was transitioning through entities. Did he?
See, this is interesting because we're able to look back at it from a deeper perspective. We can look up from the sky down at a story where when it was coming out, he died at the end of Zero Hour because...
Oh, yeah, okay, right? My bad.
And then he sacrificed himself at the end of Final Night to start the sun, and that's when he became. But then he didn't become the Spectre until Day of Judgment a little bit later.
Yeah.
But if you look at in that moment, that means he died twice within a 10-year time period.
That wasn't even 10 years. That was like 5 years.
Dude, yeah, it wasn't small. This is my point. But see, I always think about conversations we have. The characters have to be having the same conversations.
Oh yeah, I love it.
Yeah. So to me, at some point, somebody in the DCU has to be like, are any of us ever going to talk about how all of us have died? So that's the stuff I find really interesting, and that was stuff I did want to explore, and that's some of the DNA of it. Don't get me wrong, there's a bunch of big fights, and there's danger and high stakes, and other shenanigans, but those are pieces I definitely wanted to play with. Yeah. What
you just said is my second favorite part about the build up to Dark Crisis. Number one, as you know, is the name Dark Crisis.
Yeah.
How did that happen? Just tell me. Was there a boardroom involved? Was there a whiteboard?
No. I mean, it got, it was brought up a few different times as a title, and I always liked it, and I would always vote for that. And at one point, we were going to call this something different. We had 2 other titles for it at one point, and then I was looking at everything, and I'm like, well, if we're doing all that stuff with the Great Darkness, and it's a crisis, we should just call it Dark Crisis. And so I pitched that, and we went for it because it made sense, and also. Some of the other, one title I had originally had, I'm not going to say what it was too much of a tongue twister. With Dark Crisis, you're going to remember that title. And at the end of the day, that's what you want. You want people to remember it. You want people to imprint on them so that they want to buy it and engage with it. And so that was part of my thoughts on like, no, we should definitely call it Dark Crisis.
And now, a quick word from one of off-panel sponsors. Macroverse is a next-generation digital comics platform, and one with an astonishing number of comics, with currently over 50 series from over 100 creators on their app, with a 5-star rating both on Apple and Google's app stores. Download the app and binge all their titles, including the Eisner-nominated Remind from Jason Brubaker, Lisa K. Weber's Hex 11, which has been described as Harry Potter meets Blade Runner, or the new queer supernatural adventure series Husk that launches on November 1st. It's just $4.99 a month to subscribe to Macroverse, with proceeds directly supporting the creators on the platform. Keep an eye on the future of Macroverse 2, as 2022 is going to bring an epic upgrade that offers a new level of digital collectability and more, with early adopters able to sign up for more information at macroverse.com. And now, back to the show. I mean, think about all of the biggest events in DC history in particular, almost all of them, besides Crisis, the original one. Which everybody, I think almost everybody calls Crisis at this point. They don't say
it's not Crisis at this point. Yeah.
But I mean, like, even like they're almost all 2 words. It's like 0 Hour, Final Night, Infinite Crisis, Final Crisis, etc., etc. All the ones that people actually bring up are typically 2 words. And I don't know, there's definitely power to something like that, because it's kind of like Jim Chung's presence. It's like there's an inherent suggestibility of importance when you see the word crisis and a 2-word sentence.
Yeah, and also the initials are DC, so it all comes.
Oh, look at you guys! You're geniuses. You're geniuses. Are you like? Is there a part of you that genuinely kind of fanboys out about the fact that you're writing an event, or do you have enough professional separation?
No, dude, I have so much work to do. You have no idea, dude. Like,
I read your intro, man. You have so many comics you're writing. I was like, I went on your Twitter and I thought you were making some of these comics up. Like, what are you doing? You got too many comics.
Oh no, I write a lot of books, and there's other things I'm working on, and there's things we haven't announced yet and stuff like that. And so I'm always working on something, and I don't have the time to, I guess you could say, appreciate it or freak out about it.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of people relying on me, and I don't not just let them down, but it's like it's my responsibility to be professional and get the job done. And it's like I have artists and editors. I mean, in a lot of ways, the whole assembly line. I mean, it does. The whole assembly line starts with me, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like, I have artists and inkers and letters and designers and colorists that rely on me to make sure I do my job. So I don't have time to be like, to either freak out about it or to fanboy out about it. And I don't necessarily think that way all the time. I mean, I wonder how I would act like 10 years from now when I look back at it and appreciate it. Mm-hmm. I don't want to overthink it too much. My job is just to think about the story, and, the story is always the priority, but then I want to make sure I take care of the people that I'm working with. And so I don't know, let my brain get too lost in in that piece of it. But I also think that sometimes that can lead into having ego, and I don't want ego to be the thing that leads me. I just want it to be the story. So I don't know. I don't really fall on those holes. I think of like the fanboying out of like, I'm doing this thing, it's just never been me. I have too much work to do to worry about it.
I do want to say you do have time to text Bendis about Secret Invasion questions, an event that came out 14 years ago.
Hold on. That's different. I didn't write that. I didn't write that. It was a different thing.
I know. I'm just sassing you.
I mean, I read a lot of comics. I've read a lot of comics. I love celebrating other people, what they're doing, and there are times where people are coming onto a book, and I definitely get really excited about that for them, and I talk to them about it at times. But no, I don't really.
You can get lost in it.
Yeah, if I ever get it, it lasts for all of 2 seconds.
Yeah.
Oh, it's like I remember when I got the job on The Flash. It was a weird, there was a lot of stuff about that at the time. But when I got the call saying that they wanted me to actually come in to sit down with them, I'd already been in the office a few times about it. But when I got the call, it was like, we are flying you down here to spend time in the office for a day. I was going to spend 1 day in the office to map out what Flash was going to be. Somebody called me that night, and they were like, they basically were like helping me get my travel arrangements together. But they asked, like, well, are you excited? Like, are you pumped? Like, you celebrating? You're like breaking out the champagne. And I was like, Well, no, I have to do the dishes. Like, essentially the thing I'm gonna do right now. After that, it's get to work. I this is gonna sound really silly, and I'm not comparing myself to this, but I guess I'm going to a little bit. Did you ever watch West Wing?
A bit.
So in the first season of West Wing, there's a moment where they talk about President Will Bartlett, and his whole thing is like, what's next? What's next? Like once they tackle the problem, what's next? I'm very much like that. I'm very much just like, okay, let's go. Like even today, I was talking to DC about a project that's in the future, and as we were talking about, it, I started getting quiet, and they were kind of like worried that I was getting quiet. Like, well, what's going on? I'm like, I'm just thinking about it. Like now I'm gaming it out in my head. Now I'm thinking of the logistics of it. I'm thinking of how does it work, not just in terms of story, but also schedule. Like you start, my brain, once it starts going, in that direction, that's the thing I'm doing. Like I'm thinking about the story, and then I'm thinking about covers and promos and logistic and my take on it and trying to figure out the math of it, right? And like I have to be, this is something I've learned in my time working in comics. I have to be obsessed with it. I have to. If I'm not obsessed with it, it's not going to work out. So if I'm obsessed with it, I'm not thinking about like, I'm not living in that moment, I guess, a bit. I'm working. Like I'm going for it. So no, I don't really spend a lot of time, celebrating the fact that I'm writing a crisis. I'm also superstitious. I don't really feel like I don't want to celebrate anything.
Yeah, yeah. I like to think that the person who asked you if you're excited and had drank champagne, in their head, I like to think that they decided that you were doing dishes because you already drank the champagne.
Oh no.
I do want to ask about one thing that's interesting about your position these days is that when you have so many different things going on, you have all these architectural things going on. Even something like, one thing I think is interesting is that you came on to Batman with 118. And then Chip Zdarsky is coming on with 125, as if there's like a million other Chips. I don't think Chip Kid's writing Batman.
Yeah.
Anyways, but
he has, but go on.
It is interesting to look at all of this. And I mean, like that's one of the things that's kind of difficult is like you're talking to me about these future projects you're working on. And if I remember correctly, I'm not going to say that you said it was Rogues, but I know you told me a while ago that you're working on a Black Label thing. That's the thing about all of this is like it's hard to get excited about these types of things too because it's always part of a larger plan, I imagine. And it's you can't really separate the moment from tomorrow because tomorrow defines everything.
Yeah, I mean, also with Rogues, it's like I wrote Rogues. Jeez, I wrote Rogues at the end of 2020. Like I started writing it probably in like September, I think, of 2020.
Yeah,
and it's coming out now. So it's interesting to like, in a way, I'm like, this is a piece of work that I'm definitely like revisiting more. Like it's not something I wrote 6 months ago that's coming out now. I wrote it a year and a half ago. So it's that kind of leads in that thing of like, I'm in a weird position. By the time things are coming out, I've already moved on in a lot of ways. And so I guess it's harder to live in the moment with those kinds of projects. It's hard to like celebrate. It's different. I would say it's a little different when you get to go to conventions. We haven't got conventions in a while.
Yeah.
Like not really. Going to conventions can kind of amp up living in the experience a little bit. I think if you're able to go to a con and sign books or go to signings and kind of, I don't know. I also don't, I never feel, I struggle with compliments, right? Like I always feel uncomfortable with them, to be honest. And so when people praise me on anything, if let's say, so to me, I don't feel like it's really fair for me to be the one to celebrate things, right? So if somebody else is celebrating a piece of work I did, in my brain, I'm very just like, well, thank you, but I don't necessarily like, it isn't something I feel I need or I absorb in a way that is like, power. I don't get power from it, right?
Right.
But again, I'm always, one thing that Dan DiDio said to me one time, essentially he basically said I should live more in the moment. I was having a meeting with him and we were talking about DC stuff. This is a long, and we were just, bouncing ideas around, talking about stuff. And then Dan kind of was like, I wish you would focus more on the moment. Sometimes you're always thinking too many steps ahead. You're always thinking of the future and always thinking X amount of steps out, and he was right. Like that is definitely something I was doing at that time period, like I was always like, what's next? Goes back to the thing I was saying. I was always like, what's next? What's next? What's next? I would say I've definitely gotten less of that. I'm less hardcore about that. Possibly I would say because I pretty much know what I'm working on for the next, like, I would say I'm fairly close to knowing exactly what I'm working on for the next like 4, possibly 5 years. Like I know what I'm doing. I know all my projects. Every once in a while things will pop up and I get new ideas. But I would say like 75% of my schedule is booked out for a while.
Yeah.
So I'm maybe less of that. Now I'm just about, I don't know. I also have like, this goes deeper into like a writing thing. I feel like I finally hit the stage where I'm like, oh, okay, I guess I've broken in. Because even when I was doing stuff, I always felt like I was still breaking in or hadn't fully broke in. And I had this kind of attitude of like, I had certain goals I wanted to hit, and I've hit those goals, and now my goals have changed. And so it's kind of about like, you know, how do I put this? Like, I'm just challenging myself in different ways
Hmm.
now. So that's also, it has allowed me to slow down.
Is it the same with when you're doing your own books? Like, was it like that with like, I mean, obviously your frame of reference for your career has changed dramatically since like something like Nailbiter or even
Yeah.
like Birthright. But at the same time, were you always kind of approaching with that what's next mentality even to your own stories? Or has it been, let's say, elevated by your rise at DC?
I would say it went like, I don't know. This is audio, so you can't see what I'm doing right now, or you can see, but people aren't going to see. But I basically went like this in terms of that, and then now I'm kind of here,
He's
and
up
I'm,
and down. It was a bell curve.
yeah, it was up and down, and then now I'm kind of leveled out.
I love that 4 or 5 years planned out is leveled out for you.
Yeah, it is to me though.
That's wild. You're so much better at planning than me. I'm horrible at planning. I'm like next week maybe.
I have like 5 whiteboards in my office, so I'm definitely a planner. I mean that was even when we were doing the events like metal and death metal. You know, Scott, James, and I all had different strengths and different things we would do, and I definitely was the like. I definitely was the, like, let's bust out a calendar and see how this actually works. You know, like let's actually apply it to a calendar and see how these like. Because I was thinking with death metal. So with death metal, for example, if you ever read death metal, if you put all of it in order, the issues, the one shots, the minis, all of it, you actually should put it in order in the order it came out.
Mm.
Because that is the best reading experience. Because we made sure that it was essentially a weekly book. Like we really looked at it and we were like, and that came down to me, Scott, and James looking at a calendar. I mean, we really went in there and we were like, well, this lands here. This has to happen here.
Yeah.
So if you read it like that, and so I've always been kind of wired that way. I've always been a bit of a planner. I've always been even when I was doing small press stuff and doing self-publishing, I was always gaming stuff out further out. I don't know. I've definitely, I don't want to say I've settled because I'm still hungry and challenging myself differently, but I don't have that like, I don't know. It's a different. I guess I just feel like it's different now.
This fits into a patron question I got. Dennis Hoffman was very curious about the larger role you have. He said he's been a big fan of your work since Masks and Mobsters, and he's always considered you an indie creator-owned guy, even when you were writing The Flash. But, you know, in the last bit, he described you as becoming like the DC guy, describing you as the closest thing to Jeff Johns at the height of Blackest Night, which that's a lot. That's a lot.
It's a lot. Yeah. I would not agree with that. Yeah, it's a lot. I appreciate it. Thank you.
He said that the short version of what he wants to know, which won't be a short answer by any means, is how did it come to be? Was it just kind of related to that plan and keep pushing, or like how did that happen? I mean, I imagine it's like a lot of the ways or reasons that happened were things that were largely out of your control, honestly.
Oh yeah, sure. Well, even before, well, okay, so I still felt that way. I still felt like an indie guy for a long time. But then I was talking about this with somebody recently that like I had a couple of Vertigo books and we did Nail by Returns, but it's been a long time since I've done a like brand new creator owned number one. And I think that has definitely changed my, I wouldn't call it position, but I guess people's view of me. And like you were saying, like people now are like, oh, he's a DC guy. Where before, you know, I came up from self-publishing and doing image books and, you know, doing mini comics. So I was definitely that person. And then now, because I haven't done it in a while, but also like we were talking before about the turnover of readers and new readers coming in. If you even look at like a new reader for the last 5 years, those new readers, they only know me as a DC person.
Some people don't know Chip Draws.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That's what he came up as an artist.
I was talking to an editor about a creator who was like a big hot name 10 years ago. And they came up with a conversation and they were like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And I was like, oh, 10 years is a long time in comics now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think because of that turnover. But, you know, after when we were working on Death Metal and I was wrapping up Flash, I have a good relationship with DC, and I'm always pitching ideas. I've been in these rooms for years now, right? Like we would do these event planning rooms, or we would do these story planning rooms, and I would be in there and I would be pitching and talking, and I know DC really well, I know the history really well, and not just like the history of the stories, I know the publishing history really well. And so because I know that stuff, like if I'm in the room, I'm able to raise my hand and mention story stuff and do some deep dives into things, deep cuts. That's what I should say. I was like, I'm able to pull out some deep cuts on story stuff or history of DC, but again, not just history of DC in terms of like, oh, in this issue, this happened with this character. I'm able to talk about the actual publishing history of the company and how these events worked. And so when I'm trying to think the timeline here, as we were getting ready for Infinite Frontier, it was very clear that James's priority at that time was Batman. Like James was all about Batman in that moment, but also all about creating our own. Like he had those two priorities. And I didn't have, I was starting to work on Robin, and I had worked on Rogues, and we were talking about Deathstroke. Like I had things I was working on, but I wasn't working on anything. Like I wasn't working on like one of the main marquee characters, but I was talking to them about a lot of stuff. And when Infinite Frontier started coming around, it was very clear that I was sort of the one stepping into the role of taking over it, right, and really guiding it. And because I have that relationship with editorial, and I have a history, like Flash sold really well for its entire run. That's why I was on it for so long. So when DC looks at all these pieces, it was kind of like, well, let's talk about this. Because I was just pitching story. I mean, that's what it comes down at the end of the day, and it's always this. People might try to make it about something else. It's always about story, and it's always about pitching. And so I was able to get in there, and I pitched a story. I said, here's what I think we should do. And I pitched them a plan. I was like, here's what I want to do. Here's the 3-act structure to this idea. And they liked it. And I had that. I mean, that's really, I had to pitch it all editorial and get questions. I mean, that's really, I went in there, I had the opportunity to pitch a really big idea, and I went and I just pitched a story. And that's it.
I read that Justice League 75 is basically the beginning of the 3rd act. So did you have that in Dark Crisis in that plan back then? Or the idea of them?
Yes and no. There was, the idea of them. So there's pieces that have changed. There's like one big piece that changed, but the rest is all the same. And that, like the 3rd act, without getting too specific into like where it was going to take place, the 3rd act of the Justice League dying, that was always the beginning of the 3rd act or the end of the 2nd. It's the bridge between the two pieces, right? Like that was the plan in my original pitch, was that this was going to happen, and then there would be an aftermath for it, and that would be the 3rd act. There's a couple of things that have changed throughout, and there weren't any specifics of like issue numbers or which books, but there was definitely a
framework
planned.
Yeah. I had a retailer tell me that the reason why they love your stuff is because you get the lore. You're the lore guy. I've never really heard comics described as lore. It's always canon or continuity. It was the lore was surprising.
I've heard lore a lot more recently. I know the history of the DCU fairly well. I don't know everything, like Steve Orlando knows certain pieces more than me, and so do there are other creators that know pieces more than me, right? And even when it comes to like Batman, like James is partially because James worked on Batman pretty much since the beginning of New 52 all the way until last summer, realistically, when you think about it.
Yeah.
That like every once in a while I just go to James about a Batman question. Like I went to James yesterday about a Batman thing. So James knows it. So I don't know all of it, but I know enough, and I will do my research. Like I'll do my due diligence. I'll get out there and I'll figure out what it was, or I will reach out to creators sometimes, just ask them questions and figure out what they were thinking about doing, or what was behind certain pieces. I've always been really curious about the history of comics, and so if I ever get an opportunity to talk to a creator and just be like, yo, what was up with this, I will take it. But yeah, that's fascinating that they see me as the lore guy.
I think it's funny because now we're going to transition into Rogues, a comic that you've been done with for a year and a half. This is like a weird question. Does it feel kind of quaint comparatively? Because it's so small compared to... I don't mean that in a bad way. I love Rogues.
It's very grounded.
Yeah, it feels real.
It is a very different beast. I don't feel like it's small. I wouldn't use the word small. I would use the word intimate. And I think one of the hardest parts of superhero books, to me, and people can disagree with this, is finding yourself in it, right? Like finding ways to put a piece of you into the book, right? And with Flash, I was able to do that in certain ways, but it's sometimes difficult to, when you're doing these things, like when you're doing these big events, you're trying to say something about the past, like I was saying, like the past, present, and future, all of this stuff. But you also want to say something about life and something about yourself because there's only you, right? Like there's only one you, so this is your opportunity to show that uniqueness through these characters and through your, or in creator owned stuff through your story. And when I was working on creator owned, I was always doing that. Like those things always meant something to me. Like Nailbiter was about something to me. Birthright, all that stuff. And with Flash, in a lot of ways, I was saying something about Flash and my thoughts on Flash, not so much about me. Like there's a couple arcs in there that are kind of about me, but for the most part, it's about Barry Allen and my thoughts on him. With this book, it was a lot about me, and then there was a lot about the Rogues. Like this is one where it was something deeper on like multiple fronts, and I was really nervous about it. Like even working on it, I remember working on it, and just it was actually surprisingly, once I got the outline done, it was surprisingly easy to write because I know those characters well. I have their voices in my head. And then it was just about me talking about myself because I, to this day, have a lot of financial anxiety. Like no matter how successful I am, I will always have feelings of financial anxiety and always have feelings of, so I years ago when I was in therapy, and I remember talking to a therapist about this, and it was the idea that like I've always struggled with the idea of feeling safe. And a lot of that ties into money. So there's a lot of feelings involved in all of that, but I always felt this idea of safety and money equaled safety to me in a lot of ways. And to this day, when I'm like, considering projects, this plays a part of my head, and I have to like, try not to think about it at times. And so with this book, the idea of all of them in this position in their lives where they're unhappy and they're, it's like for Cold, I think the moment where Cold realizes that he has settled, and he realizes he's settled, and then he's pissed off about it. But then every character after that, a lot of their stuff is in some way about financial anxiety for a lot of them, except for Heatwave
and Trickster. I mean, Trickster is like, it's complicated.
Okay, financial anxiety is about more than money.
Sure.
Like you can have different values of different things to different people, and for him, the fame and attention, that is the currency for him. He has the money, but he's unhappy. Why? Because his star is fading, and that is the financial insecurity for him, right? Is that and so I really wanted to do a story about that, and there's other pieces that will come, and there's some more twists and turns that are coming for the book. So for this book, I wouldn't say it was small. I would say it was a more intimate look at these characters and a more intimate look at the DCU, but I'm also putting a lot more of myself in it. Well, when you're working on a creator-owned book, it's your world, right? Like it is your world with your co-creators. When you work on a DC book or a work-for-hire book or a larger franchise book, that is not your world, right? In more ways than one, right? That world belongs to a lot of people. And so you get to play in that world, but there are limitations to that. And I always struggled with those limitations. Like I always struggled with, like with Flash, I think part of the struggles I had on Flash was that I was very precious about the history of Flash, and I didn't want to deviate from certain things. And I was very precious about Mark and Jeff's work on it. And you can see that in the work, right? But it also made me put limitations on myself while I was working on it. And there are times I look back at that and I'm like, I wish I had like broke free from those limitations at times. With this book, because it was Black Label, those limitations were less.
Yeah.
And I don't know what my brain that unclicked. I was like, oh, I treated it a little bit more like a creator-owned book than anything I've ever done at DC. I was able to unlock that part of my brain that did Nailbiter and Birthright and Ghosted and apply it to these characters because there was a freedom there, because I wasn't so constrained by continuity or constrained by some of the limitations, I felt a lot more free with it, and so I was able to just do something very different with it.
I was actually going to ask about, I mean, like, Rogues is about financial, like, insecurity, but it's also, like, to a certain degree, like, kind of coping with the you that you used to be. Like, it reminded me of, like,
Yeah.
what it would be like if you're a professional athlete and like what your life is like 20 years later when you went from like top of the world. Look at Tom Brady. Tom Brady retired for like 2 months and he couldn't deal with it. And then he unretired because like the idea of continuing with his life in a way where he wasn't at the peak of what he did. I mean, I'm not trying to get into the amateur psychology of Tom Brady right now, but it's like it reminds me of that. And then Dark Crisis is dealing with death and legacy. I guess what I'm trying to say is, Josh, I'm trying to get into the amateur psychology of you.
Yeah.
It does seem like almost like you're dealing with some stuff through all of that, and I'm not saying it's in a bad way.
We're all dealing with something, David.
I know. I'm dealing with a cat right now who's losing his mind because I have my door shut. He's going through some anguish, but it was interesting reading that because, like I said, I mean that when I wrote about it a little bit today for my the poll column, I compared it a little bit to Catwoman: Lonely City, Cliff Chang's Black Label book, because it does remind me, like that athlete angle reminds me of it, because at a certain point these villains or these heroes or whomever are going to be past their peak and trying to confront with what they once were and maybe what their lives were once like, especially in the Trickster's case, is a really fascinating grounds. It's a fascinating place for a story.
Yeah, I didn't know Catwoman was being developed at first. I found out later, and they essentially established that it was going to be they were going to be like sister books, to each other, right? They were going to be siblings, and different takes on an idea, because we were talking about cover ideas and stuff. And that's where it sort of came into play, having some of those conversations. And that book is great. I mean, Cliff Chang is amazing. I'm fascinated with the many twists and turns of life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like who I am when I was 20 versus who I was at 25, who I was at 30, who I was at 35, who I am now. I'm always fascinated with how those things change. One of the ideas that I thought about a lot when I was working on Birthright was, you have, like, we're talking about loss, right? And you have this idea of, you know your past and you know your present. But I think we have this idea of our futures as well, right? Like you kind of visualize who you'll be in the future. And sometimes when it doesn't work out, I don't know if we necessarily deal with the loss of that version of ourselves. And that was a big part of Birthright. That sometimes you might have this idea what your life is going to be, and it might take a different turn, might go a different direction, and that's okay, right? Like it could be a good thing. So you need to kind of see where that goes, but part of that process might be mourning that other version of yourself.
Yeah,
and that is, I'm always fascinated with these ideas, right? Like who I was 10 years ago is drastically different from who I am now, and who I was, I would say, like 14 years ago, just a different life,
mm-hmm.
right? Like I would say the one constant was me trying to work in comics, but I live in a different state. I mean, there's all kinds of, and that sounds like a silly version of that, like living in a different state, but so much of what we go through are these changes, and can you let go of some of those things and move to something new? Like, I'm always fascinated about when we're about athletes, like athletes who retire, what do they do next?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm always curious about that. I mean, do you just retire and just sit on your couch and do nothing? Of course not. They go do something else, and then what if that something else becomes a whole new career for you? It becomes a whole new thing, and sometimes that can be very unexpected. But also, life is, and goes to Snart and Cold, life is long. We always talk about life is short. Life is also super long. And you can hit a point in your life where you realize you're not where you're supposed to be, and you don't recognize the world around you. And that's what Cold is going through, right?
Yeah.
Like, he had this idea of what his life was going to be. He had this idea of what his future was going to be. And then suddenly he is not that person. And I think in that issue where he goes to work and he looks out the window and he sees the mural of, blue collar workers, we built Central City. And he's like, hell yeah, because who he is, hell yeah. He goes to work, has a crappy day at work where they're laughing at him, and it just sucks. On the way back, And I'm not sure if you can tell this in the book, but like that is a bright spot for him every day is seeing that mural. Like he sees it every day.
Mm-hmm.
And then he looks and it's been destroyed.
Yeah.
And that's the true moment where he snaps. I mean, also think the idea that he recognized that he had settled into his role because he was relieved and happy that they gave him that raise.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like he was relieved he wasn't in trouble and was getting fired. He was getting a promotion. He was relieved and happy by that information. He had accepted that life and that wasn't the life he wanted. And so he completely lashes out. Like at the ending, the fact that he kills, getting a spoilers here in case you haven't read it, but I know you have, but if anyone's listening.
Yeah.
You know, the fact that he kills those guards, he breaks, I mean, I think the rogues always had a rule of like, you know, we only kill if we're going to be killed. Like self-defense is okay. And at that moment he thinks it's about self-defense, but he's acting out. You know, he's lashing out because he's unhappy with the stuff that happened earlier, but because he's settled. And now he's like, well, I'm doubling down. Like he's swinging the pendulum as far the other direction as he can.
Yeah.
He doesn't want to go back. But that's the thing. He wants to swing it so far it'll never go back. And that's part of his arc throughout the whole story.
I will say he was way cooler with working in like a box factory or whatever it was than I would have expected for Captain Cold. And now, a quick word from one of Off-Panel's sponsors. That sponsor's Bad Idea. Bad Idea paid for the sponsorship, but they won't give me anything to promote since they're over. So here I am saying the name Bad Idea. Contractually, I have to. That's it. Bad Idea. Their thing, I guess. And now, back to the show. Okay, I'm gonna give a quick spiel about it. It's your new DC Black Label series with artist Leo Max, colorist Mateus Lopez, and letterer Hassan Otzman El How. The solicit of it is 10 years ago the Rogues disbanded, went their separate ways, but time has been kind to the former blue-collar supercriminals caught in an endless cycle of prison, rehab, dead-end jobs, broken relationships, probation, and endless restitution fees. The Rogues are sick of paying for their crimes. Luckily, Captain Cold has a plan. One last job that will serve them, will leave them all richer than their wildest dreams and free from their past if they can survive. I described it as Superior Foes of Spider-Man meets Red meets Ocean's 11. I do think one thing that's really interesting, though, is like Snart is obviously the core of the story. He is the George Clooney to their Ocean's 11. However, it's fascinating it's actually similar to George Clooney in Ocean's 11 for that matter. His perception, his idea is that he needs to bring them together because they all need this. But he's willing to destroy his quote unquote family's life to make himself feel better or feel something. And that, like, for a perfect example of that is his sister. His sister is, I mean, honestly happy. She's working as like what is she working as? It's a social worker.
She's a social worker, but she's frustrated too because I think she thinks no one listens to her.
Right.
And so the fact that he says he basically tells her, whatever you want me to do, I will listen to you. And that is what wins her over.
Right.
Is the fact that, you know, he will listen to her. But yeah.
But I mean, she's making a difference. And then like a lot of the other ones, like, you know, Bronze Tiger is another great example. He's found something, like he's Bronze Tiger as a anti-violence person is like an all-time twist.
Yeah.
Anyways, but I mean, like that stuff is interesting because I mean, Snart has always looked out for himself, but at the same time, like it does put this interesting kind of push-pull between the cast where he's ready to go to a place where they're not. And at first it's Gorilla City, but then it becomes like kicking people's heads off. And it's a really interesting, I don't know. I mean, like I love it. It feels like the Rogues, but at the same time, because time has passed and because they went into different phases of their life, it's interesting to see one person holding on so dearly to the past while the rest of them want a taste of it, but maybe aren't willing to go there yet.
Yes. I mean, you just nailed everything that we were doing. I mean, you know, I think as much as he's a villain.
Oh yeah. He's a terrible person.
Yeah. He's a villain and he's always been manipulative. You know,
like their big mission in the book is to break somebody out of what turns out to be rehab. I mean, like that's Anyway, sorry, continue.
No, that's the whole thing. Yeah, he is so desperate to go back to who he was that he's going to manipulate his quote unquote family. But that goes into a lot of ideas, you know, about abusive families, you know,
right?
And how he is
toxic relationships.
Yeah, he doesn't want to be his father so badly. that he's become him. I mean, he talks about that early when he's talking to Lisa. He's like, I don't want to be dad. I don't want to be dad. I don't want to be dad. Right. But his dad was abusive, and he is becoming his dad because he is being abusive by manipulating these people, but then essentially forcing them into this situation, because you can tell throughout the issue they're all hesitating, and then the ending they're kind of like, this is bad, we want to go back, we want to, we're done here. And then he pushes them into the point of no return, without their consent. I mean, that's abuse, right? And so that is what I'm doing with him. And there's more complication to that, of like what he is going through. And in some ways he's going through a midlife crisis. That's definitely a piece of the puzzle. And there's some stuff in issue 2 and issue 3 that we explore with some of those ideas. But yeah, I mean, he's definitely manipulating them in the name of family, which I think he's always done, I mean, if you go back and look at stuff, it's interesting, like, you go back and read Jeff's very first issue of Flash, and he has Captain Cold kill a cop in it. He kills somebody in that, and I always thought that was an interesting statement on the character, because before that, I feel like the Rogues and Captain Cold in particular had been kind of treated as like not a joke, but they weren't as serious. I mean, Jeff spent a lot of time on the Rogues and building them back up. That was a major piece of Jeff's run, but I think with Captain Cold having reminders that like he is a villain. Like I love Captain Cold, and I've worked on him a lot. Like I wrote him a lot in Flash, and I have a lot of thoughts on him. And with this, I just wanted to kind of, express those thoughts on him in a different way.
Yeah, I love all the Rogues, and it's really interesting to see them in this way. I mean, you talked about how different it is writing for Black Label, but so a quick example. I'm not going to name names. I'm not going to like defame any books this week. I haven't read it, but I had somebody text me this week about like a certain Black Label book that came out, and the idea that maybe it was not reflective of what their vision of the character was. And I do think sometimes there can be a misunderstanding as to what Black Label is, where it's like, it's kind of Elseworlds in its own way. Like, you're telling stories that build off of our idea of these characters, but are not being told necessarily in the continuity that we know, so to speak. And I'm interested in, like, when you go to that, you start with the same foundation of the Rogues, but are you able to do, I mean, besides like extreme violence and cussing and stuff, are you able to do different things with the Rogues than you would have been able to do with your Flash run?
Yes. I mean, a big piece of this, oh man, there's a lot to unpack with that, I feel like. Having it be 10 years in the future gave me a lot of freedom.
Anything could happen in those 10 years.
Anything can happen in those 10 years. So it allowed me to put them in certain positions and put them through certain changes to get them where I wanted them to be. I have complicated feelings on continuity. I am obsessed with it in some ways, and I feel like it's a cool tool to be used, but we shouldn't be chained by it. Yeah. Like, it's a tool to be used. I also feel like, and I've been saying this a lot more to people, but like, I'm going to quote the Matrix here, like, there is no spoon. And I find that really fascinating when people come to me and they ask me all these questions about continuity. I'm like, I hate to say it's not real. I don't think that's fair, right? And I think it has value, right? And it is important to the story, and it is important to mythology of these characters in the DC universe. But there is no spoon, right? There's no hard and fast rule. So I have complicated feelings on this, because to me, there are times where I'll be in a meeting with an editor or another creator, and they'll bring something up, and I'm like, well, actually, in this issue, I'm like, back 10 years ago, 20 years ago, this happened. Like, I do get that way sometimes. And I think that's actually one of the things that is, I'll give an example is Rom V. Like, and I've talked about this with Rom V, so I'm not completely talking out of turn, but Rom V definitely has their own point of view on comics and hasn't been reading comics their whole life and is not a continuity junkie the way I am. And so they're able to approach all of these stories, these characters from a very different point of view. And that's one of the things I love about their writing and the things I like about the things they're doing. And I always think that with a lot of creators that are coming in, like, I don't necessarily have the attitude that, like, oh, if you don't love it and know it, you shouldn't be here. I don't have that at all. I want more people because they're going to bring a different perspective. They might see something I never saw before. So I have very complicated feelings on it. And when I was doing this project, it was like, I was talking to the editors about this, because there was one moment with one of the characters where they were like, they brought up something. There was something that was happening in the book. And I was like, well, but this happened. Like, there's foundation here in the continuity for these things that happened in the books 10, 15, 20 years ago. And they were like, you don't have to worry about that. And I'm like, listen, I know you're telling me that, I'm still going to worry about it.
Right.
Like, I'm still going to have that in my head because that's who these characters are,
Yeah.
right? Like, this is who Captain Cold is. And, but the 10-year time gap allowed me to move the story in certain ways that I wanted. And then I also was able to kind of play around with certain things in the freedom. And that's also part of why the first page and the opening sequence kind of is the way it is, right? It's like the very first page, I show a bunch of different villains, but I show different versions of the villains. So it doesn't ground it in any one continuity.
Yeah.
And so I think that also, I'm automatically telling the reader that this is not a sequel to anything you know. This is not connected to anything you know. I'm sure you have questions about continuity. In this particular case, it doesn't matter.
Oh, yeah. I think you were saying I have questions about continuity. I don't care.
No, not you.
Yeah.
I thought you look on your face and you got worried. I'm like, no, I'm not talking about you. It's surprising sometimes how many people let it trip them up too much. But again, there's no spoon, you know?
Well, I was talking to when I was talking to this person about it. They said something like, continuity is like the foundation of all superhero stories, and I said my opinion, as I describe it, is like continuity are the spices you add to the story's recipe, and it's like you can choose to add some spices sometimes, but you don't have to use all the spices all the time. And so it's like it's like whatever fits best for your story, but it doesn't have to all trip you up all the time. But I do want to say I love the beginning. I love the story, or like the combination of like the opening scene that's set in a bar, which what bar is that? It's a bar with no name, literally, which is a Marvel thing.
It's a bar with no name. I know. It's funny. I had a name for it in the script, and then I actually forgot to put it in when we were doing the lettering stage.
Yeah.
And when I saw it in print, and I realized I forgot, I was like, I'm leaving it.
It's a bar with no name.
Yeah, I'm leaving it.
You should have still named show up. You could have. You had grounds.
As far as I'm concerned, it's Condiment King's Bar. That's it. That's Condiment Lounge or whatever. That's not the name. That's not the name I had. But that's, as far as I'm concerned, it's his bar.
But it's so perfect because I mean that plays off of like continuity. That is a thing that no one's gonna know. I actually had no idea who that character was in the beginning. The ape. Yeah, I had to Google that. I found out. Showed up first.
On the ape. Yeah.
Showed up in Showcase 77, I think, first time. I now know the first appearance. But it was interesting because that was such a perfect setup because it was a tone setter while also setting up the heist that happens 10 years later. It's very well done. I'm complimenting you. I hope you're okay with that.
Yeah, I'm okay with it. Yeah, I'm glad people. I'm actually happy when people pick up on the things we're putting down. That was the foreshadowing was coming. It was that him talking to Bolt and talking to Condiment King about Gorilla Garage, and that Cole just happens to be standing there is how he heard about it, right? Like I'm glad I picked it up. I think you are gonna have so much fun with issue 2.
I'm excited.
Yeah, issue 2 I think will be really fun for you. It's one of my goals with this book is really just to I don't know, I still want to tell a story about these characters, but I also think I want to call it a goal. I think there is a certain fun to how this book rolls out that will surprise people, and I am curious how people are going to react to it. Even with this book, I had no idea. I had no idea how people were going to react to it. None. I was very curious to see if people were going to like it or not, and I had a detachment to it in that way where I was like, yeah, I just had no clue how it was going to go over with people. So it's been really interesting today.
I described it as my favorite thing you've ever written. And I think part of it is because it fuses your two sides in a way that you're never able to do. And you talked about this already. I mean, it fuses your creator-owned sensibility with like your supercomputer brain of DC stuff. And it results in a story that is like, I mean, this is not me downplaying any of your other stuff, but it reads differently than the other stuff you do. Also, I do want to say, I can't believe I haven't mentioned it yet, but you and I, we talked about Leo Max like months ago, the fact that he was, I don't know, a while ago that he was drawing this. And like, I love Leo Max. Basket Full of Heads is amazing. And him working on this book is such an inspired choice. And I don't know whoever decided it, but whoever decided that is a genius because it's perfect.
It was our editor, Amadeo. She I think she worked on Hill House. She had gotten moved over to Black Label a few years ago. And I think she or Conroy might have sent me Basket Full of Heads #1, and I loved it. Like, so I really like Basket Full of Heads a lot. Yeah, I liked all the Hill House books. And I wrote them an email about it where I was like, this book kicks ass. And I was like in love with Leo Max art in that whole book. Like I look forward to that book. I was super pumped about it. I love Leo Max art. So when they mentioned Leo Max, I was like, yes, yes, 100% yes. Yes, I want to work with him. But I was nervous, you know. I was like, is this the kind of book that they want to do? Right? And you know, they sent them the pitch, like the pitch and the outline, like character notes and stuff, and they immediately started drawing stuff, like immediately. We're like, here are the designs for the characters. Here you go. And it's really great when you can start working with somebody you've never worked before and you are automatically on the same page, just right out the gate. You know, it doesn't happen all the time. I've been lucky that it happens a lot. Like I've been very lucky. There are certain people like me and Gleb on Robin. I felt like when Gleb and I started working on Robin together, I was like, I feel like I've known this person my whole life. You know, we had a lot of very similar thoughts on the character, but like similar thoughts on comics and just a lot of similar tastes in things. So we were able to dive into a shorthand almost immediately. And that's how it was Leo Max. Like with Leo Max and Mateus and with Haas, I got to a point, and I was thinking about this a lot now, you know, as the books are actually going to print, like seeing them go to print, watching them work was amazing. Like they all clicked really quickly too, you know, like just nailing it out the gate, you know, and like all of us really felt, I don't know, it's like I don't have to talk to Leo Max that much. Like I think with some characters I talk to all the time. With Leo Max, the pages come in, I'm just like, these are amazing, thank you. You know, and I wrote the scripts towards them, and these scripts were really detailed, probably more detailed than any scripts I've written at DC. These ones were really a little more elaborate. But even with all that, like I was going probably more in depth, certain things that I normally do, and they would just take that and they would just elevate it every time, every single time. And each step of the way with that team, it was just fluid. It's one of those experiences where I can be a control freak, and this was a project where I felt very relaxed. I did not feel like a control freak.
I think on all three levels, you needed somebody that was a tonal fit. Like if you had the wrong artist on this, it would have killed the book. I mean that very sincerely.
Yeah.
And
sure.
And Leo Max is like the perfect fit. I mean, all of them are. I mean, like Mateus's colors perfectly complement Leo Max's line art. Haas's decisions are amazing. And it's interesting because that's how you get to that grounded feel. Like that, what I horribly called small, but I meant grounded. I meant grounded.
Well, I mean, Haas, I want to talk about Haas, but Haas really, you know, they pulled it together. I think that the work they did, they added like just an extra element to it. And one of the things I felt really good about with this is that everyone in the book, I'm hoping they feel this way, but I feel like they all felt that they had the freedom to do their best work and to explore what was best for the story and was best for the book. And they didn't feel like they had to do something over here just because, right? Like they were able to bring something of themselves to it. And I think they all did, and you can see it in the work. And Haas coming in and just really bringing in some really cool work. Yeah, a lot of the sound effects in that are actually done in the art by Leo Max.
I believe it.
And yeah, but then Haas was able to come in and work with that. I mean, I'm very thankful for this book just in terms of showing a different side of myself at DC, and it's me challenging myself in different ways. But that's really been a big part of what I've been doing moving forward in my career and working at DC, but also on creator-owned stuff that I'm putting together. I'm really trying to challenge myself because I feel like it's a weird balancing act. I don't know. Are you a musical fan at all?
Like musicals?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I like musicals, not all of them. I did not like the Chicago that came out, like what it was like 15 years ago. That one killed me, but I'm a huge Moulin Rouge fan.
You're talking about the Chicago that came out that won the Oscar?
I did not like that at all.
It's funny, it's one of my wife's favorite movies. She so I love musicals.
I like Thoroughly Modern Millie. You ever see that?
I haven't seen that one.
It's a good one. Long time ago.
So I listen to movie scores a lot throughout the day.
Yeah, me too.
So my wife and I will do these things where on YouTube they'll have this like, you know, the 30-minute video where you can try to guess what the music scores are, and I'm always like nailing it. It got to a point where literally there was one movie I hadn't seen, and I heard the movie score, and I was like, I bet it's for this movie. I haven't seen that movie, and I haven't heard this score, but based on the way it sounds, I bet it was for that movie, and I got it right. Like I've gotten to this point where movie scores, but with musicals, I feel like I can hear patterns in music, right? And Lin-Manuel Miranda, I had watched, I saw Hamilton live, and I watched a few things with them. And there were a bunch of things with them I watched within a small period of time. And at one point, I had watched Moana with my daughter. I'd seen it a few times, but then I had listened to Hamilton again, and there's also like Tick Tick Boom, which just came out, and then I watched Encanto with my daughter a few weeks ago, maybe a couple months ago, whenever it like blew up, right? I watched Encanto, excuse me, and I remember hearing similarities in their work. Right, it was the first time that I was like, "Oh, even if I didn't know this is Lin-Manuel Miranda, I would have known."
Right.
Like I could hear similarities, particularly with Hamilton, more than anything else. I could hear like similar things between that and Hamilton, and it was one of those things where I'm like, I would love to talk to Lin-Manuel Miranda and just ask, was that intentional? Like, are you? I don't want to say repeating yourself, but are you settling into a style? Right? Like, are you settling into you have your thing that you do? And I had read all these interviews with them about working on that musical and writing the music. And obviously, you're going through a process where it's never just one person writing it. There's a lot of hands involved and a lot of things involved. But it makes me think a lot about comics. And I've always been really fascinated about this, about how do creators ever settle into a style? And that is something I don't. But here, it's weird, right? Because if you settle into a style, that becomes what people expect of you, right? So if you deviate too far from the expectation, do you lose them? Do they not see it as you trying something different and trying to grow as a creator? Do they see it subconsciously possibly as a betrayal, right? Like you go in expecting one thing, you get something completely different. Are you like, well, disappointed, or do you appreciate the fact that they tried something different?
I think it depends on the position. I mean, like, I think writers, I think writers have a little bit more room to kind of expand into different directions. I think artists sometimes, I talked to Stuart Eminem about this once, and Stuart, I think, genuinely feels like because he doesn't have as defined of a style that he's had a tougher time because he doesn't have the same ceiling. Like if you're like Jim Lee and everything looks like Jim Lee, you're going to be able to, like, your fans are like the most hardcore. But Stuart Eminem's a chameleon. Stuart Eminem can do anything.
Oh yeah, look at Stuart Eminem back, in the '90s versus now, Heat Wave versus Spider-Man versus,
Yeah.
like,
I mean, look at what he did with Secret Identity. I mean, like, Secret Identity versus everything else he did. Even Plunge, like talking about Hill
oh
House,
yeah,
Plunge was way different. And it's really fascinating to, like, I do think that there can be, I don't want to say a cost because it's not like Stuart Eminem has been unsuccessful. But at the same time, like, I think that for hardcore, like for like the hardcore fans who just like want that same flavor forever, like it's not a betrayal, but it's just like, like I don't like that style, so I don't like it now. It's like, as opposed to like if you always do the same thing forever, you're just like, I always like that.
yeah. Well, look at you mentioned Jim Lee, like when Jim Lee switched up their style for Deathblow, right? Like their style changed slightly, but you could still tell it was Jim Lee, but they were clearly being influenced by Frank Miller at the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
But people don't talk about Deathblow.
No.
Like, you don't talk about that time period. I like Deathblow. I have that hardcover like right over here that they put out. That's all the Jim Lee stuff. But yeah, I find it it's an interesting thing to think about as a creator. You don't get too lost in that. But you're right, artists, it's a whole different scenario with artists than it is.
It's tough. It's tough. I think writers have a little bit more grounds to do it. I mean, you look at, like, Brian K. Vaughan. You can look at Brian K. Vaughan's writing, and the same hallmarks are always there. Like the strengths are there. But Brian can do anything. Like, you can do Runaways, and you have like a teen story, or you can do something like Spectators right now on Substack, or you.
Oh yeah, I'm loving it. I'm reading it every week. Yeah.
Yeah, and then like Saga is way different than like Paper Girls, and it's interesting because you can look at all that, but I mean at the same time the same strengths are there. It's like best final pages in the business, incredible at using the turns.
Yeah, grabbing you from the first page, just stuff. Yeah.
But I mean it's just like the feel is like the hallmarks are the same, but you're able to approach a lot of different things. It's like, I remember, God, I did a piece on style for artists. It's like if you put like Ivan Rice on like I don't know, like got him to do like a book for, I don't know, like First Second or something like that. First Second readers would be like, what in the hell is this?
Oh yeah. But here's the thing. Maybe Ivan would know that, and it'd be a completely different Ivan.
Yeah, well, that's true. That's true.
Like, what if Ivan came in and was like, I'm gonna do something totally different? It's funny you brought Brian K. Vaughan. I was talking about Brian K. Vaughan yesterday with, I think it was Riley Rossmo. We were talking, and I was like, I don't know. I would be curious. I haven't talked to Brian in maybe, I think, since 2019, but I think that Brian is fearless. And I would love to. I haven't talked to him in a while about this kind of stuff. I recently been thinking about this because of spectators. I would love to ask questions about that with them because I feel like they're a bit on the fearless side, and maybe that leads into the chameleon aspects. But they're not really a chameleon. It's like
You can go to different genres.
yeah, you can jump around a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, like you can do the same thing no matter the genre. But anyways, we go on this forever. I do want to close with something kind of related to this.
Okay.
We've talked a lot about the shape of comics and how things are, I mean, not, I mean, in this, but also beyond this, and how things are changing in really interesting ways between like the growth of the direct book markets, the Substacks, Zest Worlds, whatever the fuck Zest World is, and assorted secret monies in comics. I am interested in, like you said that you got to a point where you achieved what you wanted to do, and now you have a new kind of plan, like where things are headed.
Or new goals. Yeah.
New goals, yeah. Like, how are you feeling about where things are headed? Does this direction feel more aligned with those new goals than maybe it would have like 5 years ago or so?
You mean for me personally?
Yeah.
This is a complicated question. I think in some ways I've matured I've matured as a creator and as a person, and I've mellowed out on some things, and other things became more important to me. And I definitely feel like some of my goals have changed, but some of the major big pieces have not. Like I would say certain ideas of where I want to be at 5 years from now, 10 years from now are very how do I put this without getting too deep into like some of my own personal plans and goals. They haven't changed. There are certain things. How about this? There are certain things that were always there that I have now accepted. I've had people call me out on this. I was recently at a signing with Jock in December, and I was at a bar talking about some of this stuff with Jock, and Jock called me out on some pieces of this because it's obvious when you talk to me what my future is kind of looking like in some places. And so that stuff has not changed, which is a matter of me accepting it in certain things. But at the same time, like I'm just trying to challenge myself. Like I don't want to repeat myself. And so I'm kind of going through and looking at things of like, well, that's what I would have done before. How do I do this differently? And how do I, yeah, I don't know. My goals have definitely changed. Like the way I see success for myself has changed, in some ways. I don't crave attention, and I don't need that piece of it. I never have.
I guess less related to that, but I mean, do you feel like the way that, because it does feel like we're in like kind of a shift period, like a lot of things are booming. Does it align with the way that you're kind of looking at things?
I feel like it's beating me to the punch in a few places.
Sure.
There's a couple things that I look at now, and other creators I know are moving in the directions that I thought I would be either moving in now or I wanted to move in like 4 or 5 years from now, and they're already moving there because the industry is shifting in some ways. So that is definitely in my head a little bit, but that also means that I'm changing too. Like I'm shifting the directions I want to go in, and looking at creators' histories and the creators that I really like, and the creators that I look at, and I'm like, they have not let me down. And trying to like look at that a little bit, but then at the end of the day, I have to find my own path. I can't be emulating somebody else's career path. But yeah, I do feel like the state of the industry and the way things are changing in our industry does align with some of it. It's just moving in maybe faster in some ways than I was anticipating.
Yeah.
There's other things that I thought would have happened by now that have not. So, it just depends. But I think when it comes to me personally, there were certain things that I had to look at and go, okay, but I have had, I guess I'll leave you on this. At some point, there is going to be a fork in the road, and I see that fork in the road, and I've talked to people about it already. I know the fork will come. It's just when does it come? That is something that I'm still thinking about a lot. Like I feel like I have a choice at some point down the line, and I don't know the answer yet. I don't know which direction I'm going to take yet.
It's very ominous.
It's all good though. Like I guess
it's a good fork. It's not like a snart fork. You're not going to go and kick somebody's head off or something.
No. It's both good things. It's
yes.
Two good things, but when you recognize at some point you have to pick which one of the good you're going to do. And I know at some point that's going to happen. And it's been pointed out to me frequently.
I'm looking forward to finding out which direction you take, or whatever the directions are. And I'm looking forward to your crises, both dark and rogue related. But yeah, Josh, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about all this.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with writer Joshua Williamson. You can find Williamson on Twitter at Williamson_Josh and his work in pretty much every comic DC is publishing. Also, big thanks to Deanna Chapman for stepping in to edit this podcast. If it sounds better this week, it's because of her. Love Off Panel and want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel, and when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site Sketched at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content, and its members-only forum. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by liking on Facebook at /Sketched, that's SKTCHD, followed on Twitter and Instagram at @SketchComic, or following me at @SliceFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Ben Damstead, Cameron Brown, Rom V, Devin Fitzsimons, Nick Walker, Patrick Coyle, Isaac Warren, Scott Carpenter, Rent Narb Studios Comics, Capes and Tights Podcast, Klaus Van de Ven, Brian, Submet Industries, Raj Patel, Jack Mulqueen, Kyle, Carl Kerschel, Robert Masella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Elliot Metz, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Scott Buwan, Michael Tunk, Canadian by Proxy, Johnny Cannon, Bradley Rader, Carl Troy, Brandon DePillis, Patrick Brower, Declan Shalvey, Dan Guarino, Josh Williamson, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, SB, Nick Bennett, Daniel Whitfield, Susanna Polo, Reed Hinckley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Charlie Chu, Stephen Hall, Pensacola Pop Comics, Kim Eslem, Philip Myra, Christian Shelton, Kenny Porter, Chris Pacello, Torin Grumbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Carl Mizell, Paul Slates, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Alistair Ross, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwan, Vita Ayala, Tara Ferguson, Dave Slusher, WMQ Comics, Akil, Kokachi, Sean Pinello, Ken Heidelman, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, David Kelly, Robert Wilson IV, Nick Plato, Brendan Fletcher, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Assey, Adam Bogart, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxwell, Cliff Chang, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Mark Abbott, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comic Star in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's theme song just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode